Here I'll be modeling the SPEcSLIMS method for annotation. And what that first requires you to do is read through the poem a number of times. I like to do that 2 or 3 times. Once you've done that, the first step is to identify the subject of the poem. In this case, it's easy. It's in that first line. It's a girl. But it's more than just any old girl. It's a girl who is experiencing some sort of pain or some sort of hurt. And I know that from the end of the poem. Now the next step is to identify the purpose of the poem. And I think because of the descriptions of the girl that we see in these first few stanzas, and we're reminded that she's hurt, that the purpose of this poem is to make us pity her. The next step is about the emotional response. But in this case, you can see that the identified purpose and the emotional response are quite the same. It's one of pity. However, the final 2 stanzas are much more general. It's not just about the girl. It's essentially about everyone who has ever felt any sort of pain. So maybe it asks us to think about our own sense of loss. I'll revisit these, of course, after I look at the craft, which is that next step. And when we look at craft, we're looking at structure, language and diction, imagery, movement, and sounds. So the first thing to look at with structure is how the stanzas are broken up and if there's any sort of pattern. Well, I can see that there are 5 stanzas. The first stanza has 4 lines, and the next stanzas each have 2 lines. I also noticed that the end of each stanza is end-stopped, which means that there is a punctuation point that causes us to pause in our reading. In fact, as I'm looking at end stops, I noticed that there are quite a few of them. In fact, almost every single line is end-stopped. More than that, but there's a bit of punctuation in the middle of some lines, 2 lines in particular. These are called caesuras. That's a lot of breaks in our reading, a lot of pauses that we're forced to make because of the punctuation at the end and in the middle of lines. To me, that makes the pacing very slow. And I believe it's so slow possibly because we're meant to think deeply on each of the individual images that the speaker conveys to us. I also noticed that the beginning of the poem tends to be much more specific to the girl and descriptive, literally descriptive. And as the poem moves on, we start to see more use of figurative language, and it moves from not just the girl, but to a wider audience. And that makes me relate back to that sense of the emotional response. So after looking at the structure, we then look at the language and diction, and that means we're looking for individual words that are rather strong. And in this case, I think a lot of those happen in the description of the girl. So first we see that word freezing in a telephone booth, and I think that's pretty strong. Notice that it's written in the continuous present tense, which means that it's currently happening and it continues. The next word that I identify there as a strong piece of diction is that word huddled and the word flimsy. Both of these indicate that she is trying to defend herself, but can't quite do so. The next strong pieces of diction that I see are those descriptions of her face. In particular, the idea that her face is stained and it's also smeared. Both of these imply that the face isn't exactly as it was meant to be, that staining is when you add color to something, and smeared is when lipstick is not put on in a good way. And I think these are meant to highlight the emotional effect. The next words that I see are the terms thin and little. And the reason that these stand out to me is because they are repetitive. If they're little, then quite likely they're thin. Certainly if they're thin, they're quite likely little. But this highlights that she's young, but also fragile. As we continue down, the next word that stands out to me is this idea of beat. And that stands out for me because it's a strange way to describe someone walking. It's really aggressive. And it might imply that she's angry with the situation, which certainly makes sense. The other key word that I see there is the idea that she has to be alone. And the reason that stands out to me is because she was in a conversation with someone on the telephone. So why is she alone? But also, being alone indicates that you're maybe vulnerable or fragile in some way, which matches the pattern seen with the other pink highlights. The final word that stands out to me is this word glittering at the very end. It's strange because glittering often has a positive connotation. This is something bright or flashy. That seems odd when put with the rest of this poem. So we've looked at just the individual word choice, the diction. Now we want to look back for those strong images and the use of figurative language. The first is that full phrase of freezing in a telephone booth. And this provides us with a nice, direct, descriptive image. We know exactly who's there. We know exactly where she is. And in fact, I've highlighted this because perhaps it's even a metaphor. Perhaps she's not literally freezing. Maybe it just means that her heart is getting cold, which essentially means that she's been hurt and she doesn't want to show her emotion. Some of those other descriptions in the next line could help to reinforce the figurative reading of that word freezing. Huddled in her flimsy coat. If we take this metaphorically, it means that she's emotionally vulnerable. And in the end of that first stanza, where we see that it's not just that she's stained and smeared, but her face is stained by tears and smeared with lipstick. These details allow us to picture this girl and perhaps even empathize. Next, the piece of figurative language that stands out for me in the second stanza is this idea of her fingers like ice. On the one hand, that means she's cold, but on the other hand, this could again be a reference to the idea that she's freezing, or that she's emotionally freezing. And more than that, ice itself is something that's fragile. It's easily broken. The next piece of figurative language we see there is almost just sort of a description, where we see that there are glass beads in her hair. I don't think these are actually glass beads, but I think that's ice in her hair. So we get to see the extent of the cold. This one down at the bottom, where it says the first frost of telephone phrases. That's really key. When I just read the initial first frost in the title, or in the line right above it, I thought it was about winter. But this case, the term is being used figuratively, the first frost of telephone phrases. And so that implies that frost is, again, like we've noticed before, this idea of being hurt. Now that I realize that, I can go back to the other instances where frost is mentioned and realize that maybe it's also figurative. I've highlighted the icy streets because if streets are icy literally, that's clear. But metaphorically, it could be that they're unwelcoming. Finally, when we see this description in the last stanza, the start of winter glittering on her cheek. On the one hand, it could be a literal description of winter on her cheek, but on the other hand, this could be an image of the pain that has now marked her. It's not just internal, but because she's been through the experience, it's more serious. The next step is to look at the movement, the rhythm or the rhyme. And in this case, there is no consistent rhyme scheme. I think what's more important is the rhythm. And as I think I mentioned before with the structure, the use of all these caesuras and end stops creates a sort of staccato rhythm where we can't quite read it in a flowing manner. And I question, why would they want a staccato rhythm other than forcing us to think deeply for each image? When someone cries or when they're really, really upset, their breath comes almost in this staccato, halting rhythm. SPEcSLIMS asks you to look at the sounds that are present in the poem. And certainly we notice a sense, a repetition of certain plosives and sibilants, both alliterative and within the middle of and the ends of words. So I've noticed that, but I also noticed there's quite a bit of the sound as well, as in stained and tears and smeared. So I want to highlight those. Now I haven't circled the S here because it's not creating the S sound of start. It's more of a Z sound, is. But wow, that's quite a bit. If I just look at the circles and the squares, there's quite a few plosives, the F sound, and there's quite a bit of sibilance there, the S sound. These are sounds that cause us to use quite a bit of our breath when saying them. Which, when I think back to the idea of the rhythm being halting and staccato, perhaps these are meant to mimic the strong emotional breathing that's coming out possibly from the woman or whenever any of us are hurt. Putting it all together, I want to go back to my initial ideas of the purpose and the emotional response before finishing with the poem. So I go back to that, and I've said that the purpose is to pity the girl. However, I think there's more than that. When I look at the movement from the specific to the general, I think we're also supposed to realize that pain is something that's within our own life. And when I think back to First Frost, I realize that, well, winter is a natural cycle. Yes, it comes, but it's followed by spring and the rest of the seasons, and then again, winter. So it's inevitable, but it's also something natural that we will get over. And that's it. I've used my annotations to identify a theme.